Typhoid is also known as enteric fever, and it is one of the most common or most important diseases when it comes to areas with poor hygiene, like in the developing world. And there are many things that come to mind whenever I think about typhoid fever: the high rates of misdiagnosis, as well as the historic stories of Mary Malolin, who was also called Typhoid Mary. But I'm going to try to keep it short. So if you're new to the channel, please do subscribe before we continue, and drop a like on this video. And let's get started. So when you look at typhoid or enteric fever, it is going to be a systemic infection that is caused by, say, some Salmonella enterica, and specifically a sort of a variant of it known as Typhi. So most of the time we just say Salmonella Typhi. And we have the Paratyphi, that is Paratyphi A, B, and C, and these ones are going to cause a milder form of the disease, and they are transmitted by the fecal oral route. So basically, they're shared through the feces, and the feces find their way into food, and the food into the mouth. And it is characterized by a prolonged fever, a bacteremia, intestinal lymphoid tissue involvement, and it has some potentially life-threatening complications if you're going to look at in detail. So when you look at the epidemiology, it is endemic in areas of South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the high risk factor in these places is the poor sanitation, contaminated water, as well as being under 5 to 15 years of age. And then we have the chronic carriers that also are able to occur in about 2 to 5%, and this is going to be due to the Salmonella Typhi harboring in the gallbladder and then intermittently shaded over different periods of time. So when we look at the etiology, we have the gram-negative. It's going to be a gram-negative model facultative intracellular bacillus. This means it is always going to survive inside the cells, and this makes it on human-only reservoir. So Salmonella can only exist in human beings, and it is acid-resistant, and it survives the gastric barrier. So when we look at the pathophysiology of how it comes about, it's going to begin with the ingestion, and when it's ingested, it's going to survive the gastric acid and finds its way into the ileum, and reaches the ileum via the M cells, which are found in the ileum. It is going to invade the ileum at this point of the M cells over the Peyer's patches. Now, the Peyer's patches act as the lymphoid tissue in that ileum. So when they enter into the Peyer's patches, they're taken up by the macrophages and they're going to survive into the macrophages using the dietary secretion system. And then after they have entered the macrophages, they're going to be carried around, they're going to go to the lymph nodes, they're going to be sequestered in different places, and then they are going to start now to be released into the bloodstream, and this is going to cause the primary bacteremia. And when it enters the blood, it's going to now be carried to the residual endothelial system, and that is composed of the liver, spleen, and bone marrow. And then, so when it reaches these points, we are going to have its endotoxin, the lipopolysaccharide that is found on its cotton, is going to cause cytokine release, and that is going to cause a sustained fever. These are the pro-inflammatory cytokines, cytokine 1, 6, and TNF-alpha. Then we have the Peyer's patches, where it entered at first. Sometimes they are going to undergo necrosis, and when they undergo necrosis, they're going to undergo bleeding. And the bleeding eventually is going to lead to perforation. And that is one of the most dangerous complications of typhoid fever. Then sometimes we have this retrograde movement to the gallbladder, and when it gets to the gallbladder, it's going to stay there, and we shall have a chronic carrier. And this was going to shape these salmonella in the stool. So when you look at the clinical features, I tried to divide them according to the weeks. And this is very important to know because different weeks are going to have different manifestations. So during the first week, we have the invasive stage. And most of the time, we just have a stapler fever. This is a fever that is going to be increasing, remains constant, then increases again, remains constant, kind of forming a ladder. Sometimes they have a cortic tank, they have malaise, headache, anorexia. They have constipation more than diarrhea, and then they have a relative bradycardia. This means much as their fever is going high, we would expect their heart rate to go high in proportion. but you find that the heart rate is a bit lower than the expected heart rate at that temperature. Then we have a mild hepatosplenomegaly. Then during week 2, we have a sustained high fever, and that is about 39 to 40 degrees. So we may have the step-ladder kind of thing not so prominent here. And then we have a dichotic pulse, and this is a pulse with 2 peaks, where one peak is read to be weak. Then we have abdominal pain and distension. We have sometimes the rose spots or the salmon colored blanching that we're going to see on the track. And this is not common, but this is one of those features that are going to occur in week 2. We have splenomegaly and the toxic look, as well as delirium, or what we call the typhoid delirium. Sometimes the patient has that neurological decompensation. Then in week 3 now, the complications are going to begin here. It's when we can have intestinal hemorrhage, the patient becomes toxic, they become anorexic, they have a full green yellow diarrhea or pea soup diarrhea, they develop ileal perforation. Of course, then may not develop this all the time. The clinical course is going to vary per patient, that is very possible. Sometimes we have encephalopathy, myocarditis can occur, and because of invasion of the bone marrow, sometimes we can even have a pancytopenia. Then in week 4, sometimes you have resolution, or sometimes the patient proceeds to a carrier state, and this is going to be the effervescence, which may have profound weakness, or if you have an asymptomatic carrier state, like for the case of Mary Mallon, who was also now called Typhoid Mary, who was able to infect even up to around 51 people. And she moved household from household, and most of the time by the time she left the place she was working at, the people had already died due to this typhoid fever. And for her, she was not affected in any way. So when you do the investigations now, when it comes to investigations of fever, this is very tricky because we do not have the single sensitive test. And the different weeks are going to have different tests being more sensitive at that point. So when you begin with the things like the hematological tests, some do like a CPC or a leukopenia, and this is classical. The white blood cells go down in typhoid most of the time, and then you can have anemia as well as a thrombocytopenia. Then when you look at the microbiology now, week 1, the gold standard is going to be a blood culture. But if you have started antibiotics, the sensitivity of this test is going to go down. In week 2, also in week 1, a bone marrow culture is one of those most sensitive tests. And for it, even after antibiotics, at least 5 days post antibiotics, it may remain highly sensitive. Now, remember this course is very important. Then in week 2, that is when the stool culture becomes positive. And so when you're diagnosing typhoid in week 2, stool culture is the one that's going to be very important. And it is the one that also helps us detect carriers, though it requires multiple samples due to the intermittent shedding of this salmonella. If it's from the gallbladder, it's going to be released intermittently, not all the time. So you may do one culture today and it's negative and it's positive. Then you have a urine culture. It's also used for carrier detection, and it has a low yield. In most cases, it's one with a low sensitivity. But if we're trying to check for carrier state, most of the time we use a stool culture, and urine culture are going to be multiple samples. Then we have the serological tests. We had what we used to call the white dot test, and the white dot test has very low specificity, and it used to take for the O and H antigen on the salmonella. But nowadays, it is no longer an acceptable diagnosis because of the increase. Almost most people have been exposed to this, and they have the antibodies. So even have individuals without typhoid, we may find that they actually do have the white dot test that positive. So it is no longer an acceptable test for typhoid fever as of 2026. Then we have some rapid and diagnostic tests that are coming up, like Typhoid, Tubex, and these ones are going to have a rapid variable inaccuracy. Then sometimes you can also do imaging when you have the hepatosplenomegaly. You can do X-ray, CT when you have perforation, and when you have perforation, most of the time the sinus is here under the diaphragm on the right side. So if you look at the complications, we have the GIT complications. This is going to include GIT bleeding and perforation. CNS, we can have delirium and encephalopathy. CVS, we can have myocarditis and shock. Hepatic, we may have hepatitis developing. We may have anemia and leukopenia due to bone marrow infiltration. And then in people with sickle cell, typhoid or salmonella is one increases the risk of osteomyelitis, especially of the hip, of a hip bone, of a femur bone, yeah. Then when we look at the management is going to be one to do the supportive first, where you get the fluids, we improve the nutrition, we want to give antibiotics, trying to isolate the patient and ensure hygiene. Then most of the time we begin antibiotics empirically, and then we go culture guided. So when we have this complicated or this severe disease, ceftriaxone is given IV, or we can use cefixime oral and azithromycin if we're having a less severe disease. And we also use fluoroquinolones if it's sensitive. So in my country, in Uganda, we find that most of the patients are becoming more and more resistant to these fluoroquinolones. So the trends have kind of changed. So the duration of the medication is going to be 7 to 14 days, depending on how severe the disease is. If it's not so severe, 7 days may be enough. If it is, then 14 days. Then we have indications for surgery sometimes if the patient gets a perforation or if we have massive hemorrhage. And sometimes when we have the carrier state, you may want to actually give a prolonged course of antibiotics. You may actually go as much as up to 5 weeks of antibiotics coverage. And even when this doesn't work, sometimes a cholecystectomy is one of the possible measures to eradicate the carriers. You remove the gallbladder. So when you look at the prevention is important. Clean water is one big step, and hand hygiene. And we have now the vaccines, the VI polysaccharide TY21A oral. This is an oral vaccine. Then the VI conjugate, it has also been used and preferred in endemic areas. So we've come to the end of this video. My name is Benjamin and this is Medwan Feature. If you did the video is beating, leave a thumbs up, leave a comment, and let's meet in the next video. Please do check out another of my videos about infectious diseases, that is malaria. Thank you very much.